Even if you don't plan to film a movie anytime soon, this video will show you all the basics about how your camera works and get you on your way to blowing everyone away with your newfound camera skills. All in 10 minutes. So grab a cocktail and a soda pop and settle in, because you're about to learn something. So let's get right into it. All cameras work in 3 interrelated principles in order to make the image that you want. This is sometimes referred to as the exposure triangle. Depending on the environment and the look that you're going for, you'll tweak these 3 settings to get the shot that you're envisioning: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These 3 things define the vast majority of how your camera works. Each setting has the ability to bring more or less light, but with some secondary consequences and caveats that you may or may not want. More on that later. The reason we use the term exposure is because your photo or video is a result of light being exposed to the camera's sensor. The longer the light is exposed, the brighter the image, until eventually it goes from total darkness to totally white, or underexposed to overexposed. Think of it like the sun and a magnifying glass. The longer you hold the magnifying glass to the surface, the brighter the image is burned into it. This is the concept behind our 3 principles. At the end, we're going to put all 3 together and show you how to use them to get the results you're envisioning. But before we get into that, I'd love if you liked and subscribed this channel. It'll help me tremendously to be able to make more of them and teach more of you all about making top-notch content for your business, Instagram, or even your own YouTube channel. Okay. So shutter speed. Shutter speed is often measured in fractions of a second, as in a 50th of a second, or 200th of a second. This is the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to light. If you have very little light in the environment, then you might need an unusually longer shutter speed to soak up as much light as possible, like say a full 10 seconds even. With a really long shutter speed, you hear 1 click, which means the shutter is open and the sensor is receiving light, and then another click 10 seconds later that tells you it has just closed and the image capturing is over. If the shutter speed is very fast, then you'll likely just hear 1 click as it opens and closes in a fraction of a second. During that time, whatever light imagery is coming through the lens is getting burned in. This includes anything that is moved during those 10 seconds. If the entire camera moved, then the whole image will have motion blur, which you probably don't want. If it was on a tripod to prevent that motion, but you took a picture of a friend and they moved during those 3 seconds, then everything looks right except your friend looks smeared with motion blur. Making the shutter speed faster will fix this motion blur issue, but it will also not capture as much light and may result in an underexposed image. So in summary, a longer shutter speed equals more light and more motion blur. A shorter shutter speed means less light and less motion blur. Aperture. Simply put, aperture is a measurement of how big or little the opening in the lens is. Lenses have special blades inside that can either make the opening very big or very tiny at the center. The measurement of how wide or narrow the opening of the lens is called the f number, or in video or film lenses, it's called a t-stop. Have you ever wondered what that f with a slash and number after it on a camera lens stands for? It's telling you how wide open the lens can go. Strangely, the lower the number, the wider it can go. Why that is the case is for another video, but for now, just know that an f2 has the ability to let in more light than an f4. 2 things are affected when you open or close the aperture. Number 1, more or less light is allowed to hit the sensor, making a brighter or darker exposure, and number 2, the depth of field is made wider or narrower. Depth of field refers to what is and isn't in focus. So a wider depth of field means everything in the shot might be in focus, whereas a very narrow depth of field means that maybe only the subject matter is in focus, but the rest is out of focus. In summary, a lower f number equals more light and shallower depth of field, and a higher f number equals less light, but more of the shot is in focus. ISO number. The last principle of the exposure triangle is ISO. What you need to know is that in the days before digital cameras, ISO is the number of your film stock. For example, back then you might buy Kodak 200 or Fujifilm 1600. The higher the number, the more sensitive the film was to light, meaning it needed less light to make the same exposure. Unfortunately, it also meant that your image had more grain in it. Today, that grainy look is called noise. Those same numbers are carried over to the ISO of your camera. So ISO 100 is what you might use for a very bright day in the sun, and ISO 1600 might be what you would set it for a dimly lit room indoors at night. If there's too much light in your image, meaning it's all white or overexposed, you might try to take your ISO down. If the image is too dark and underexposed, then you might want to take it up. Just know that the higher you set your ISO, the noisier your image will look. What does too much noise look like? It looks like this. Compare that to an image with a very low ISO and you can see how much cleaner the image looks. In summary, high ISO equals brighter image, but noisier, and low ISO equals darker, but cleaner image. Now let's try and use these 3 settings for certain situations to show how they might work together to get the shot that we want. Okay, for the first example, let's try to do a portrait in a dimly lit room. Let's say we're in a low light situation and we're taking a photo or video of someone. We want the image to be exposed correctly. We also want the background blur to separate the subject from the background. First, let's make sure our aperture is wide open so that we're getting as much light as possible. Based on the lens we're using, we can go all the way down to f1.8, but it's still underexposed. So let's take up the ISO to the most we can before it gets too noisy. On this camera, it's about ISO 1600, and it's still underexposed. So our last option to bring in more light is the shutter speed. Let's take it down from 1/400th of a second to 1/60th. Since our subject is occasionally moving and talking, we can't go any lower or they'll have motion blur. So this looks pretty good. Next, let's try something like a bright morning landscape shot. In this case, the sun is very bright and we want all the image to be in focus, including the things closer to the lens and the things off in the distance. So let's set our aperture to something high. We want the aperture closed down so that it lets in very little light, something like f11. Next, since we have so much light, let's make sure our image is nice and clean with no noise and take our ISO down to only 100. Finally, let's say we don't have a tripod and we want to make sure that there's no motion blur in the image, so we'll put our shutter speed up at 1/300th of a second. Nice! Okay, now let's try some trickier shots. Let's try to take a photo of stars at night. Everybody likes these photos. Taking photos of stars at night can be very difficult for new photographers. First thing that we're going to do is take our ISO up as high as possible before it gets too noisy. Let's really push it up to about ISO 3200. Next, we want to make sure those stars off in the distance are nice and sharp. So let's close our aperture down just a little bit, something like f3. Lastly, it's still way too underexposed, so our last option to bring in more light is simply a very long shutter time. We want that sensor to soak up as much light as possible from those stars, and that means a shutter speed of a full 20 seconds. Since we can't hold it perfectly still for 20 seconds, we're going to need a tripod. Also, even pressing the shutter button on the camera might make it move a little, so we want to set a 2 to 10 second timer to start after we press the button. And not bad! Okay, for our last example, let's say you want to take a photo of a person during a bright day, but you want that narrow depth of field to get a nice blurry background. So let's open our lens all the way to get a nice blurry background and set it to f1.8. But now we have a problem. Having the lens all the way open is allowing too much light in and the image is way overexposed. But we don't need a high ISO because there's lots of light, so let's bring down our ISO as far as it'll go to ISO 100. But it's still too bright. So our last option to bring down the light even more is our shutter speed. We need the shutter to open and close extremely fast so that it hardly lets in any light. Let's set it to 1/4000th of a second. Whoa, that's fast. But it worked. We can now have a shallow depth of field in a bright environment. Unfortunately, when it comes to video, solving this problem will involve using ND filters. But that's coming soon in another tutorial, so don't forget to like and subscribe to be notified when that comes out. Depending on what your creative priority in the shot is, you can select one corner of the exposure triangle to be locked, and the camera will do its best to make adjustments on the other 2 corners to get a proper exposure. That's why these letters on the dial of your camera are called things like aperture priority and shutter priority. Real quick, here's what those letters on the dial at the top of your camera actually mean. Auto. The camera will do its best to set everything for you. However, it's not a mind reader and often is not exactly what you want. P stands for program and is mostly like auto, but with a few things that you can set the way you want. A stands for aperture priority. S stands for shutter priority. And M stands for manual, so you can set all 3 aspects of the exposure triangle just the way you want. Another very important part of using your camera properly is making sure your white balance is correct. Auto white balance is the safest bet, but it's not instantaneous, and often your photos and videos might be inconsistent in color because your camera is constantly shifting the white balance. To find out more about white balance, be sure to watch my next free tutorial all about lighting, coming up next week. That's it for now. I don't want to fill your head with too much at once. Go out there and practice shooting photos or video with your camera and using this new knowledge and camera settings to make the images in your head become a reality. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more tutorials about how your camera works, making short films, taking much better photographs, and lots more about making incredible content. See ya.